Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Nice to see you all here. And hello, Mac. Nice to see that you finally made it. Hello to all our new friends and everybody who wants to participate and join in the discussion. I will try my best to answer your questions. Of course, it's not certain that I'll be able to answer them. I mean, I may give some kind of answer. I don't know exactly how correct that might be. But again, I'll try my best based on what I've learned and on my studies. Then if there's something I can offer as a kind of explanation, then I will try my best. And then if I haven't studied it, and I'll try to rely on my own personal experience in my own meditative practice. And then finally, if all else fails, then I'll just have to use my own kind of worldly experience. But I have to say that my worldly experience might not be of much use because I've not succeeded very much in the world in general. So my Lama always makes this joke about me. He says, and it's generally because in the retreat, then I fix all kinds of things. I kind of know how to fix all kinds of things and do all kinds of different jobs. So he makes this joke and he says, well, if you've got any questions, go ask Choga. He'll be able to answer you. But don't ask him about relationships. Because famously, all my relationships have failed in my life. So it's kind of a joke. Anyway, so I'll try my best. But on the outset, and again, let's remind ourselves of why we're here. And it's absolutely fine, whatever motivation you have. You just have to kind of be honest with that, right? So if you have this motivation to experience bliss or to experience non-thought, to get away from all of your chaotic thinking, then it's good to know that that's your motivation. And then you'll be able to look for the kind of remedies and the methods that will help you to achieve your goal. And likewise, if you want to be liberated from samsara, well, there's a set of instructions for going beyond suffering. And primarily that's about realizing no self, getting rid of our clinging to self. And then also, if you have this sort of Mahayana motivation, that motivation to become a fully enlightened Buddha for the sake of all sentient beings, then that's also wonderful. And then there's a set of instructions related to that. So whatever practice you engage in, then at first it's really important to fix your motivation. And in general, then in the Buddha Dharma, we say prayers and things like that, but it's not necessary to say prayers. I mean, in our practice, chanting and praying is very effective and useful. It helps to make the mind very clear, and it helps one to develop this kind of intent, and you could say devotion in your practice. And also if you're meditating and you're falling asleep, then it's very good to do some chanting. It tends to wake you up a bit. So at first then, setting our motivation, and we'll try our best to look at some of these questions. And then Jersey has got a very intelligent question here. And it's one that obviously is beyond the scope of a 1-hour question and answer session, but I'll just kind of give an overview on this. And he wants to know the differences between the 5 disturbing states of mind, which is symbolized by the 51 disturbing states of mind that are symbolized by the 51 skulls on the red dakini, and that and the 84,000 different types of disturbing states. So first, we have to look at the English terminology that he's using here, because it's a little bit misleading. And also we have to look at this in context of the Vajrayana. So in context of the Vajrayana, we talk about these 84,000 obstructing spirits. So what they're called is geks. The term we use in Tibetan is gek. And it's like, we get this impression that some kind of evil, sharp-toothed demon. But they're not really. They're mental events. And so you could say they're obstructing forces. But what is obstructing is our own cognition, our own conceptual thinking. So in the Vajrayana view, on this kind of red dakini practice, etc., these are all part of the Vajrayana view and the Vajrayana practice, then the the principal point is this sort of recognition of utter purity. And so that everything is pure. And what we do in the Vajrayana is we visualize deities. And this is kind of related to a question that's coming up later. So these things are connected. It's very important. And so by that, some people get the mistaken impression that this Tibetan Buddhism is about deity worship. But what you have to understand that these things are all symbolic. Okay? It's symbology. And so these 51 skulls represent the 51 mental events. And so we've got what's called mind and mental events, these two aspects of cognition. And so they're not really, to call them disturbing states of mind can be misleading, because there's many different categories within that. These 51 mental events are broken up into different categories, and one of these categories is the 11 virtues, for example. And within the 11 virtues, then we've got things like the sort of devotion and intent, mindfulness, meditation, wisdom, these sort of things. So we don't see these normally to be negative. And likewise, things like faith and virtue are parts of these mental events. But within them, then we also have things like the principal or root afflictions, the 6 root afflictions. Now this might be an interesting point, because recently I've been doing this talk on the view that is free of all views. And somebody suggested that this wasn't authentic Buddhism. But what you have to understand is this comes from the Abhidharma. And these 5 views, these kind of mistaken views that we need to abandon, are part of these 51 mental events. So within the 51 mental events, then we have these 6 root afflictions, and one of them is view. And when it says view, it means these 5 views. So that's one point. So this teaching on this ultimate or final view is talking about these mental events that are one of the categories in these 51 mental events. And you have to understand that in different renditions of the Abhidharma, then they're represented differently. For example, sometimes there's 47, 49, 51, 71. It's just the way it's presented. But they're categories. Now, in terms of the Vajrayana, why is this important, these 51 events? Well, a Buddha is a being that has gone beyond mind. So the term we have that we use in English is sentient being. That's for an ordinary being. It's called a sentient being. And literally it means has mind, or is possessed of mind. And a Buddha is a being that goes beyond that, goes beyond conceptual thinking. And the Vajrayana view is basically that all phenomena are equilibrium, they're non-dual wisdom. So they're beyond good and bad, coming and going, arising and ceasing, these sort of things. And so what we need to do is we need to transform what are impure events into pure events. Or what we need to do is recognize the natural purity. So traditionally, and classically, as you've heard in the Vajrayana, then we talk about the 5 poisons as being the 5 wisdoms. So the afflictions themselves are wisdom. Now this is a very difficult point for Westerners in general, because when they hear this, then they think, oh great, the afflictions are wisdom. I can go and get drunk and have sex, no problem. So it's kind of like that. We find it like an excuse for us to fall prey to our afflictions. The problem with the way that we approach the Vajrayana is that our desire to get off our head and have fun is coming from a position of these mind afflictions, or from a position of conceptual thinking. And these 51 mental events are all about conceptual thinking. So within them, then you've got things like meditation, wisdom, faith, but you've also got anger, desire, ignorance, those sort of things. They're in there. And so for somebody's Vajrayana view, then none of these things are good or bad. They're all kind of equal. And these sort of mind poisons are wisdoms, the things that we see. They say the 5 meats and the 5 nectars. They're things like excrement and urine and blood, semen, feces, these sort of things are seen to be pure substances. So right from the outset, we can see that this Vajrayana view is really difficult for us to understand. But it's not just a philosophical position. Remember this last video I had about the view that takes views to be supreme? Well, it's not about clinging to a theology, clinging to doctrine, clinging to philosophical ideas. It's about how things appear to us naturally. The natural way that appearances arise to mind. And that's thoughts, mind, and appearances. It's anything, right? Sound, sight, smells, whatever they are. And the way we kind of discriminate about our perception creates these notions of good or bad, but they themselves appear in a particular way. So somebody who has an understanding of meditation will understand what I'm talking about, and somebody who doesn't understand meditation won't understand what I'm talking about. It's very difficult. But just the way something like, an object in front of us, a form that we see with our eyes appears, is the truth of the Vajrayana. So it's not something divorced. It's not just some conceptual idea. It's not a doctrine. So here, then, Jerzy, I wonder if Jerzy is from Poland or somewhere. Sounds like a Polish name. Then what is the difference between these 51 states of mind and these 84,000 geks, what they're called, or disturbing spirits, or you could say negative emotions? Well, you have to understand that these things are purity, right? Now, they're represented by 51 skulls, and the skull represents, you could say, the empty nature of that phenomena. Okay, so the first thing we have to do is we have to understand the empty nature. And when it comes to the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, as you remember, the first turning of the wheel of Dharma is about the 4 truths. The second turning of the wheel of Dharma is about emptiness, primarily. It teaches that all phenomena are empty. And then when you get to the Vajrayana, it talks about perfect purity. And people often think that you don't need the view of emptiness when you come to the Vajrayana, because Vajrayana talks about things being perfect, pure, permanent, and also talks about it as being self, because in the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, we say no self, right? So this is a really hard point to understand. But the important thing is that the Vajrayana takes emptiness as granted. It doesn't replace or supersede emptiness. Actually, emptiness needs to be there before you can even embark on the Vajrayana journey. And you can see this because the very first thing you do at the beginning of a Vajrayana sadhana is you declare emptiness. So what it is that everything is free of characteristics. This third turning of the wheel of Dharma, the Vajrayana, is this signlessness. It's the teachings on signlessness, that all things lack characteristics. Whereas they appear, they lack any substantial characteristics of being good, bad, etc. And this is the meaning of emptiness. It's just taking emptiness to a different level. In fact, it's presenting the truth of appearance emptiness from the appearing aspect. And then the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, the teachings on emptiness, as we classically think about them, is teaching from the aspect of the empty nature. So anyway, as you can see, this is a huge topic, right? So there are these 51 mental events. Well, all of these 51 mental events have to be converted or have to be recognized to be natural purity or luminosity. And so this is what it represents when you see the deity. The deities are wrathful manifestations or yidams, but they're not there to destroy our enemies. That's the way we often see it, right? And people who mistake the Vajrayana, then they get this kind of, especially in the West, they have this funny idea that you're somehow like a soldier or something like that, and you're going to destroy your enemies. But what it's about is it's about deconditioning or destroying your misconception. And so we cling to difference, right, between wisdom and ignorance. But both wisdom and ignorance are part of these 51 mental events. There's all kinds of things in there. It's quite complicated. As I said, it comes from the Abhidharma. And so the deity is the wrathful means for eliminating our misconception, for removing our kind of conceptual fallacies. And so we see these horrific, kind of demonic-like creatures with skulls, and they have skins of humans. They have one is a skin of a baby, a skinned baby. I mean, that's horrific, right? If we think about what the thought is there. But for a Vajrayana practitioner, it's about transforming our normal clinging to reality into purity, or just recognizing it for how it is. And it doesn't mean that we should go out and start skinning people alive, and chopping their heads off and things like that. So we get really confused. And the reason why we get confused is because we don't understand the Vajrayana view. And that's because we don't have meditation. Somebody who has meditation understands the meaning of this. So anyway, that's a brief kind of presentation of what these 51 mental events. Basically, they're anything that is beyond merely awareness. So mind is the aware aspect, okay, or is this kind of empty aspect that is merely aware. And then what is it aware of? It's aware of kind of arising phenomena, and those phenomena can be classified in many different ways. And so the deity wearing 51 skulls is about transforming or purifying our normal perception, which sees things as good and bad and, significant and insignificant, that sort of thing, and transforming it into only wisdom or purity. And then there's different classifications of the different types of wisdom, but I won't go into that. Now, in terms of the 84,000 geks, or evil spirits, or disturbing emotions, then, as you know, then there's taught to be 84,000 types of Dharma. So there's the 84,000 teachings of the Buddha. In fact, there was a recent translation, I think, into English, and it's called 84,000. So these 84,000 different types are 21,000 different ways of transforming the negative mind poisons, the three principal negative mind poisons. And so there's the 84,000 dharmas or teachings, and they eliminate these 84,000 kind of evil spirits, 84,000 obstructions. And now what are these 84,000 obstructing spirits? Well, they are 21,000 associated with anger, right? So of course, I can't sit there and list off what these 21,000 are, right? We're going to be here all day. And it actually came up in one of the tantric texts we were studying. But basically, aside from like reading through it really fast, you don't go into it in any detail, because it's massive, right? You have to refer to the tantras for this. And we wouldn't even remember it. So the important thing is to understand that there are what we call male deities, female deities, and these kind of naga deities. So sort of male and female represent emptiness and method, right? Or wisdom and method. So this anger has the male deities, 21,000 male deities associated with it. And so these are the obstructing spirits of the 21,000 male aspects of anger. And then there's this, and then we have 21,000 associated with ignorance, and that is the nagas. So a naga is like a kind of water spirit, like a reptilian. They're kind of like dragons and reptilian water spirits and that sort of thing. But I think it kind of represents neutrality. So we've got these three negative mind poisons. First one is anger. That's associated with male energy. We can see that, right? Male energy is kind of wrathful. And then there's the 21,000 associated with ignorance, that are these naga kind of spirits or evil deities. And then there's the 21,000 associated with lust or desire. That is the female kind of obstructing spirits. So the term is dun. This dun is like a kind of evil force, like a negative spirit, maybe a ghost or something like that. It's translated in many different ways. And then the last 21,000 are these mixtures, 3 of 3. So we've got we've got anger, ignorance, and desire. So we've got the anger of ignorance, the desire of ignorance, etc. So those mixed up, 3 by 3, and that's another 21,000. So in total then, as you can see, we get 84,000. But the important thing to understand here is in this practice is what we're doing is we're using these 84,000 teachings of the Buddha to eliminate the 84,000 negative mind states. And these 84,000 negative mind states are based on the principal 3 mind poisons, and that's anger, ignorance, and desire. Or the root one is ignorance, basically. And it's the same with the classification of the 84,000 types of teachings of the Buddha, is that there are the teachings that are based on removing anger. There's the teachings based on removing ignorance. There's the teachings based on removing lust or desire. And then there's the teachings that are removing the mixture of three, of these mixtures of desire and anger. Because you could have you can mix these three mind poisons. And also these three mind poisons are associated with the kind of what we call the Ayurvedic medicine of Tibetan tradition, similar to Ayurvedic. And so the mixtures of these humors or these mind poisons cause the various different diseases. So they also talk about these spirits in terms of the 84,000 types of ailments. And so a Tibetan doctor will work with substances to balance off these humors to remove different diseases, and they're classified in the same way. So it's And in general, when it comes to the Vajrayana, then there's this numerology, there's medicine, there's science, and everything is correlated to this system of 84,000 in groups of 21,000. And that also applies to our actual channels, winds, and drops practice. So you've got the creation stage, you've got the completion stage, and in the completion stage, we've got these wind practices, which is kind of synonymous with, it's not synonymous, it's what we would think of Kundalini practice. But the view is very different, but outwardly it looks the same. And it's all about these, 21,000 channels in the body and 21,000 and all this sort of stuff. And so the entire thing is developed into a very complex system. Like I say, it covers all these 5 branches, like medicine, science, etc., etc., etc. And interestingly, if you look at, for example, Burma used to be a Buddhist country, right? And now it's a Theravadian Buddhist country, so it's like yellow-robed monks, more like Sri Lanka, India, Thailand. But previously, it was a Vajrayana place. In fact, a lot of Southeast Asia was Vajrayana Buddhism. It all died out, of course. But if you look at places like Burma, then all the architecture, the ancient architecture, is laid out in these kind of mandalas. And it's all laid out on the principles of this really complex Vajrayana numerology, etc., deities and things like that. So if you've seen some deity visualizations, then you'll understand what I'm talking about. And this is kind of related to this question that Mac was asking about. And he was reading this this great jewel sutra, and it's talking about all these kind of opulent palaces, deities, and pure realms. So in general, then these are associated with a lower form of Tantra. So if you've ever done any pujas, you've got things like Amitabha, Tara, those sort of things. They're kind of, I think they're action Tantra. I can't remember exactly. I think it's action Tantra. And then this, what the first questioner was talking about, Jersey was talking about, is associated with the Uttara Tantra. So it's the kind of the highest Yoga Tantra. So there's a difference between the presentations, but they're similar. And so when you see these prayers to Amitabha, for example, which is in Tibetan, then that's a red Buddha, but in the Chinese tradition, it's Amitabha is standing up and it's kind of gray. And what we do is, as ordinary beings, we pray to be reborn in Amitabha's pure realm. So there's this notion of these pure realms, right? These celestial palaces. And these are all associated with this what we call the Sutra Paramitrayana. So it's the sutra teachings of the Mahayana Buddha that's associated with the 6 paramitas, or the 6 perfections, the practice of the 6 perfections. And in that, then it talks a lot about these pure realms. And what a Buddha does is, a Buddha does 2 things. A Buddha makes aspirations to ripen beings. So that is to make beings ripe for spiritual practice or for enlightenment. Now, a Buddha can't make you enlightened, right? So you mustn't take it to mean that. A Buddha can't create you as a Buddha. A Buddha can only kind of ripen you so you're ready to go on the path. This is one of the qualities a Buddha has, is to recognize when a being is ready, to make that leap through. And then the Buddha will always act in an appropriate time, appropriate manner. So that's one. The Buddha makes aspirations when they were Bodhisattva to ripen beings and also to purify their realm. So every Buddha has an associated pure realm. And this pure realm is kind of represented like, a heavenly place with palaces and this sort of thing. If we look at the anthropology and the way the Westerners see it, if you look at the way what people sort of speculate, Western philosophers and anthropologists, and then the patronage of the Sangha, that's the kind of religious community shifted over time. Initially, at the beginning, when the Buddha was present, then they lived in the forest, didn't really live in houses, caves and things like that. And they would go into the villages every day to beg for their food. So they lived on a very meager sustenance and kind of in a, really eco-friendly and kind of really low-key manner. But patronage shifted over time. And eventually what happened, and this is in the northern part of India, on the Gangetic Plains, then the patrons became the kings. And so there was a shift there. The royalty became the main patrons of the Sangha. And so rather than these monks, etc., going to village and just getting scraps of food, then they started having a king who would sort of provide their sustenance, would basically support the monasteries. And also they were living in monasteries. So there was a big shift there, big change. And at the same time, the imagery and the iconography changed. And it became more related to royal ornaments. So when you look at these Yiram deities and these kind of, these what we call mandalas of deities that we visualize. So for example, Chenrezig, and Avalokiteshvara and these sort of things, Tara, these are all kind of deities. They wear ornaments, right? The sort of jewels on all their wrists and ankles and their ears, and they wear silks of 5 colors. This is all kind of royal symbology. And each thing has a meaning. The 5 colored silks are related to the 5 wisdoms, etc. So this kind of outward appearance of Buddhism changed greatly. And because of that, then many people say that it's no longer authentic Buddhism. So this is an important point, is because any religion, in order to propagate, has to propagate encapsulated within a cultural framework, right? So when Buddhism moved from India into China, right, then it took on aspects of Chinese culture. It had to, necessarily has to, for a religion to propagate into another culture. It has to be familiar to the people. And we see this within our own Christian tradition, right? Because when the Roman Empire expanded and they went into these pagan territories, then they kind of appropriated their festivals like Easter, Christmas, and these sort of things. These weren't normally part of the original Orthodox tradition. We can see this when we look at the Orthodox Christmas, right? Because in the kind of Orthodox tradition, it's much later in the year. It's in January sometime. So they celebrate it at a different time in Russia. But in northern parts, like Europe, Northern Europe and Britain, then they celebrated around the winter solstice. So the religion appropriated these outer aspects of the pagan religion and then gave it a Christian flavor. They sort of packed in Christian theology into this cultural framework. And this happens with all religions, and it certainly happened with the Buddha Dharma. And so eventually when Buddhism went into Tibet, well, at that time, Tibetan religion and culture was very shamanic. And so you've got all these blood rituals and all this kind of, horrific imagery that's associated with the Vajrayana. And that's very much kind of to do with this shamanism and witchcraft in Tibet. And so Bompo and Buddhism kind of merged. But what they preserved, every time the Buddhism propagated, what it preserved was the view, the core principal beliefs. That's what's preserved. And so there's a lot of kind of infighting, you could say, between different Buddhist traditions. So in general, we've got the southern tradition, that's the yellow robes, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Burma. And we've got the northern tradition, that's Tibet, basically, and the eastern tradition. And that's, China, Korea, Japan. And there are many essential points that these groups don't agree on. And so the Theravadins, the southern tradition, often criticize the Buddhists in Tibet as being inauthentic and for many different reasons, mainly because of the way they keep their vows, but also because of the fundamental view. And this also happened in Tibet itself, where there were at some point religious wars. And for example, my own sort of lineage was made into heresy because we held this Jonang view, this other empty view. again, all these topics, the more you talk about them, the more profound and difficult they get. So basically, the point here is, well, yes, it seems to be very much kind of opulent, and it seems to be contrary, because in the Theravada tradition, they're living in grass huts or under trees, and they're eating scraps of food, and they live simple lives. If you look at the early kind of images, in fact, I've got one here of what the Buddha and the Sangha looked like, then they had these sort of simple robes, right? This is little meditation sticks we've got. They're quite good. Use them in Sekar. And so it's like a mendicant, almost naked. And then when we look at the Vajrayana, then it's all jewelry and everything like that. The important point to understand is that these are symbolic. So everything, even in this 3 robes, the old-fashioned style, then there's kind of symbolic meaning to everything, and especially in the Vajrayana. So these crowns, right? You've got Tara with this crown full of jewels. Well, how many jewels are there? There's 5 jewels. Those 5 jewels are the 5 wisdoms, but they're also the 5 poisons, right? They're the 5 Buddhas and the 5 Buddha consorts. So every single aspect is related to something that exists in the theory or in the philosophy. And like, I think what you're talking about here in this heap of jewels sutra is a lower class of Tantra, and is associated with the Sutra Paramitrayana, as I said, and it even gets even more over the top when you look at the Vajrayana. But what you have to understand is that they are encoding philosophical concepts. So when you meditate on these pure realms, etc., then you're also supposed to meditate on the meaning of those symbols. And what we tend to think is we just look at a picture. If you've ever done any Vajrayana practice, we've got some deity, let's say it's Chenrezig, and we look at the picture, and then we just try to create a mental image of that and say a mantra. Well, actually, the real way to do it is that you have to study the Tantras. And through studying the Tantras, then you understand all the different meaning that is associated with all the different elements. And I'll tell you what, it's really complicated, especially in the Vajrayana. This lower class of Tantra, the one that Mac is talking about, then it's much more simple. But in the Vajrayana, then there's an entire mandala, and every single aspect of that mandala, it has thousands of components, has symbolic meaning. For example, the palace is made out of walls, right? Well, they're 5 bricks thick, and each brick has a different color. So again, it's it's the 5 wisdoms, it's the 5 poisons. And then there's 51 of these, as Jersey was talking about, 51 mental events. Oh, these 51 mental events are actually 51 deities. They're not common conceptual mental understanding, conceptual understanding. They're actually deities in the realm. So it's all related. And so somebody who is a real Vajrayana practitioner is incredibly learned. And the problem is that these days that they are few and far between. There's almost nobody who is able to study the Vajrayana anymore. And that's because the tradition has been lost. Really, a lot of the transmission of a lot of these teachings have been lost. And so what happens now is we just receive the transmission. That's just somebody sits down and reads it to us, basically, and we don't study it. In Sekar in Nepal, then we went through a teaching cycle of about 3 months. Well, I think it was 3 months. Maybe it was only 1, but that's every day for 4 hours a day, I think we were doing this. And we had all the Kempos, the professors and things come in from the Trango Monastery, and we all got together and we did this Vajrayana teaching, and we went through this text that basically covers all the different classes of Tantras and etc. But really there was nobody there who had a really comfortable grasp of the whole thing. Probably Kempo Labu, my teacher, was the most learned in terms of the Tantras. Well, that's got to do with where he's from, Eastern Tibet, and also who his teachers were. So it's very Vajrayana heavy. In the Gelugpa tradition, they don't really study the Tantras very much. They do a very brief study, about 3 years, maybe. So first they do 21 years study of the Sutra Paramitrayana, and that's every day, like 10, 11 hours a day or something ridiculous. And then once they graduate and they become a Geshe, then they may go on to study the lower and the higher Tantras, but only briefly. And it's because it's been lost. So there's very few. Of course, there are some amazing Vajrayana practitioners, but we don't tend to meet them. they kind of disappear into the mountains. And also they appear very strange to us. You know, they tend to be pretty well naked. I mean, you get an idea of this when you look at some of the Tibetan masters, right? Dilgo Khyentse Rinpoche, who's often completely naked, right, except for a little loincloth. This is a kind of somebody with a Vajrayana view. So there were a few. There's very... Basically, you can't get an education in the Vajrayana anymore. Outwardly, some places they do study. And like I say, in the Shedras, the colleges, we do skim over these things. But mostly, it's about studying the sutras. So although this, Mac, I skipped over Matilda's question, I'll get back to that. Although this may seem contradictory, these Buddha realms with all this opulence and palaces and things like that, then mostly it's symbolic. And remember how this discussion started? There were 84,000 different teachings to undo the 84,000 kinds of afflictive emotions, or poisons, whatever you want to call it. Well, the reason why there's 84,000 different types of teaching is because there's so many different methods, because there's so many different types of people. And so for somebody, and what they say is, if you're higher level of realization or higher level of meditation, then it all becomes more simple. And you see this in the representation of the deities. So when you're a less advanced practitioner, you need more complexity. And then the more advanced your practice comes, the less complex it becomes. And you will see, I have an image somewhere, but I won't be able to find it in time. So you'll see the image of Samantabhadra Buddha. Now Samantabhadra Buddha is basically like the midnight sky and naked. This is unelaborate. And what we tend to think is, well, I want to just go straight for the unelaborate. But in order to go straight for the unelaborate, then you have to have this view of Dzogchen or Mahamudra. But we're not like that. Why? Because we have these 51 mental events. We've got good things, faith. We've got bad things, anger, etc. And there's loads and loads and loads of them. And it's not just 51 of them, it's 84,000 of them. So we're very complex beings. Because we're complex beings, then we need complex methods. But these are all methods, remember. There's method and there's wisdom. And through these methods, we're trying to achieve this wisdom. What is this wisdom? It's recognition of the true nature of phenomena, just as it is. It's called suchness, how things abide. So that's a lightning tour of the Vajrayana and a really complex topic. There's not much more I can say on that. Hello, Matilda. I would really appreciate it if you would discuss the importance of boundaries and self-protection. So I was discussing this topic with a new friend I met online recently. And this idea of boundaries is something that's kind of not something I was aware of very much. I could guess what it means. But again, I don't have a lot of experience in these worldly things. And also, the language has changed in the last 13 years. So people talk in a different way. There's a lot of vocabulary that I've not encountered that people are using. Even when people are talking about tweets and things like that, it took me a while to figure out what people were talking about. Snowflake and all this kind of stuff. But I understand that we have to set these, I think what it means is like we have to set these boundaries where, I can be very open and accepting, but at this point, then we just have to leave it there. And then this issue of self-protection is very important in the Buddha Dharma. Now, I'm not exactly sure the context of this question, but this is certainly an issue in the Tibetan Buddhism. Buddhism in general, but especially in Tibetan Buddhism in the West in recent times. And that's because we've had many situations where the students' boundaries have been overridden by their teachers. Now, there's different reasons why this might happen. I mean, famously, there was this story of Sogyal Rinpoche, right? So people were saying that he was abusing his students, sexually abusing them, beating them up, that sort of thing. Well, if we look at the ancient scriptures, then this is a tradition, especially within the kind of Indian Mahasiddha tradition and also in Tibet. So it's not specific to Tibet, because we just have to look at the Mahasiddhas like Tilopa, for example, these kind of yogi masters. They don't look anything like the Buddha of the olden times, who sits under trees, etc. They look like crazy people. They're kind of naked and wild hair and stuff like that, and often portrayed with wild gazing eyes. And they kind of subject their students to trials. So this is an ancient tradition, right? We're talking about over 1,000 years ago that Tilopa and Naropa were around. And so Marpa, that's Milarepa's teacher, was a student of Naropa. So the story that I told on this video channel was about Tilopa. Tilopa kind of seemingly just abused his student and did horrible things to him. So there were no boundaries there. And then Marpa studied under Naropa. And Naropa kind of challenged Marpa a lot, but not to the same degree. And then Marpa gave Milarepa a hard time in Tibet. So there were no boundaries. Does that mean there was something inappropriate happening? I mean, some people suggest that Marpa should have been put in prison. In the West, they do. Well, boundaries are very much about the individual. So somebody who has this unshakable faith in their teacher, and also has this irrevertible wish or desire for liberation, then doesn't have boundaries with their teacher. And that explains the behavior of the Mahasiddhas of the past. But what we have to understand is we do have boundaries. And those boundaries are there because, one, we don't have this unshakable faith. In fact, our faith is really floppy. It's like jello or something like that. And on top of that, we don't have renunciation. So we don't have this irreversible desire to be freed from samsara. So of course we have to have boundaries. And in fact, especially in the modern world, and I will say in the West, and I use that term loosely, then we have really broad boundaries. In fact, in the West, you can't even kind of suggest that there's anything wrong with somebody. Even a child at school shouldn't be chastised these days. And it's to our own detriment, because it's only through being challenged that we can really make progress. And this is an important point. So if you want to understand the context in which these Tibetan masters, and I'm not saying this is the case with Sogyal Rinpoche, because remember, as I said, there's two reasons. One is that they're authentic. They're in an authentic student-teacher relationship. And because of that, the teacher really, really pushes the student. And they intentionally do it. Why did they intentionally do that? To break down their mind poisons. So I have aversion. I get angry about things. So that teacher will intentionally try to do something that will make me angry. And why? One, to condition me not to getting angry, but also to see if my practice is going well. And my teacher does this all the time. In Sekar, I think I was talking to you about this recently, or maybe the last question and answer. Then he really pushes people. But he only pushes people who go there, right? It's a big deal, right, to give up everything and go to Nepal and live there permanently. If you meet somebody in the street, he doesn't sort of give them a hard time. But if somebody comes from the West and wants to rely on him, then he thinks, well, they must be serious and they want to make progress. And so he really, really pushes their buttons and tries to really challenge them. But if he were to do that in the West, he would be in jail, 100%. So there's this one side. There's the authentic teachers. They have compassion. Why do I say they have compassion? Well, they're being horrible to you, and they know it's risky, because you could get upset, right? You could even punch them in the face. But they're doing it out of love and compassion because they want you to progress. And then there's the other ones, and they're just con men. Or not even just con men, but there's people who gain a following, but they haven't conquered their own negative emotions. Also, they don't have compassion. And so they kind of just bully people around. And this happens a lot, for sure. So my suggestion is that you should have boundaries. And those boundaries must be set in accordance with your own natural view, right? So you have to understand that, well, I'm not really able to give everything up and go off into the mountain, Remember these old kind of yogis in India, etc., and they will lie on beds of nails, sit in a circle of fire and that sort of thing. So we have to say, well, I'm not like that. I want to make spiritual progress. I want to understand things. But I'm not there yet. And so we have to set those boundaries. And I think the problem in the West is that, one, we haven't set our boundaries. And two, these teachers from another country really don't understand the differences between the way things happen in the good old days and the way things are happening in the modern world. And it's quite a dangerous situation, actually. Why do I say it's dangerous? Well, it's dangerous for the Buddha Dharma. It's dangerous for the spiritual path, because you end up with many people who raise complaints, chase their teachers out of the country, take them to court. It's no good. It just gives us a bad impression. So Tai Siddha Rinpoche is great on this. He'll teach you the story of Milarepa, how Marpa put him through these horrible trials and seemed to have no compassion. And he'll teach about Tilopa. And one of these stories is Tilopa said to Naropa, I wonder if I've got a student who would be willing to jump off this tower. He didn't even tell him to do it, right? He just suggested that, I wonder if there's any student who really has that much faith, they would actually throw themselves from this tower, 10-story tower. And Naropa just went straight running off the edge of the tower, because he just had, my Lama must be talking to me. And he's willing to risk anything, right? So Tai Siddha Rinpoche tells this story. And then after it, he'll say, and I have to say something. If I ever ask you to do anything stupid, then run. I've gone crazy. Call the police. It's really funny. He's really honest about it, right? So what he's saying is, I'm not that sort of Lama. They did exist. They might exist now, somewhere in the middle of the mountain somewhere, but I'm not that sort of Lama. If I ask you to do something horrible, then it means I've gone crazy. Don't listen to me. So what am I saying? Be very clear. Be very honest with yourself on what your boundaries are. And those boundaries are based on your natural view. Right? If you want to escape samsara at any costs, you've given up all hope for the mundane world, then actually you'll be willing to do anything, right? You'll be willing to go and sit out in a cave somewhere in the snow with no food, because that's it. You're fed up with samsara. So if you are like that, then you have very narrow boundaries, or you have no boundaries. In terms of self-protection, this is very important, and it's something that Westerners often get wrong, because we have this kind of enthusiasm, right? So this enthusiasm is one of these 51 mental factors. One of them is this sort of strong intention or whatever. We have this enthusiasm to practice. We think, I must achieve something, but we're not honest with ourselves. And so what we do is we don't protect our own health. And then people will try to emulate the masters of the past. They hear stories about Milarepa going off in a cave in the snow with no food. And so they think basically that method is what they need to do. How did this conversation start? 84,000 teachings of the Buddha Dharma to undo the 84,000 different types of affliction. Why are there 84,000 different types of teaching? Because there's so many different types of people, individuals. In fact, it's an infinite amount of methods. So this method of really going for it, disappearing off into the mountain with no food or clothing, is for a very specific type of individual. And there are very few of those individuals in the world, right? There's a handful. 1, 2, or 3, really. I mean, in India, then the Hindus, there are quite a few pretty, dedicated practitioners. Look at Ramana Maharshi, for example, He would sit there in samadhi, and rats would be coming and eating his legs. And he would just remain in meditation. And then when he came out of his meditation, he would realize that he had holes in his legs, and then he would sort of go find somewhere, like in the basement of a church or something like that, to hide and to meditate. Little children used to throw stones at him because they thought he was a ghost or something. So there are, I wouldn't say that is the same intensity as Milarepa. It's getting close to Milarepa's kind of commitment. But for us, we're not like that. So we have to protect ourselves. And especially if you're Mahayana practitioners. If you're a Mahayana practitioner, then your goal is to help others, right? And so the analogy is, if you're standing in quicksand, then you can't pull somebody out who's drowning, right? You need to be standing on firm ground. So you have to protect yourself, and you have to protect your own health. And don't try to overdo it. And so if you have this honesty, I talk about this a lot, just knowing where you are in the cosmic scheme of things. If you have this honesty, and then you'll be able to sort of use your time effectively and productively and progress. And we have to progress slowly. So it's this simple. When you start meditating, you sit on your cushion. Don't just start trying to do too much. Like, I'm going to do 2 hours a day from day one. It's not going to work. You've just got to do 5 minutes. Even just sitting cross-legged, right? If you want to try to sit cross-legged, well, you've got to do it little by little. Otherwise, you're going to knacker your knees. I meet many people who were meditators who destroyed their knees because from the first thing they tried to do was force themselves into lotus position. And then what happens? Well, that's it. For the rest of their life, they're never going to sit in lotus position because they've knackered their knees. I know one guy who had surgery on both knees. And so he had no hope of ever doing that. Why? Not being honest with himself, not starting off with where you are and progressing slowly. This slow progress is lasting progress. And as we know, then there's different ways of achieving enlightenment. Some are quick and some are slow. And the slower ones are more dependable and progress is more even. And the quick ones are more dangerous and also more erratic. And so it's taught that the Vajrayana, this highest level of view, well, yes, it's the highest level of view, but it's not suitable for everyone because it's too difficult. And they say the Vajrayana is like being a snake in a bamboo tube. The snake can either go up or down. There's no middle ground. And most people, especially in the West, and again I use this term West loosely, then mostly they go down. In fact, a lot of people go crazy, or they develop strange behavior, where they start thinking they're deities and start their own kind of religious cult and basically mess up all their followers. And it happens a lot. So it's better to kind of, and it's not that you can't do a bit of everything, you know. You can do your very basic, keeping some discipline. And something I've talked about before, there's the 8 precepts. So we call it Nyungne in Tibetan. That's where you kind of pretend you're a monk for a day and you take 8 vows. So you don't eat after lunchtime, you don't engage in sex, any sex. You avoid all that for 24 hours. But it's only 24 hours, right? So anybody can do that. So like this example of the 8 precepts or Nyungne is that you can kind of do these things to a lesser degree. And as time goes on, then you can increase your ability. And so I think that's a wonderful thing to do. I'd recommend that for everybody, doing these 8 precepts. Maybe I'll talk a little bit about it in a video sometime. But it's just like 8 basic vows, right? For example, not sitting on a high seat or sleeping on a high bed, Really all you're doing is 24 hours, you're pretending you're a mendicant. Just spend your whole day, don't watch movies, don't look at your iPhone or your devices, don't read worldly books, don't look at worldly things, just study the Dharma, meditate, pretend you're kind of a monk for a day, and it's virtuous, and it's a habituation. Anyway, as usual, I'm digressing. Thank you for your video on Hope on Karma. Hope in Karma, and the latest one about the subjective gloominess of the universal suffering. Yeah, it's difficult, right? Because sometimes the Buddha Dharma is kind of depressing. I kind of feel like, well, why do I need to think about suffering, and hell realms and all that sort of stuff? I'm kind of depressed anyway. Can't you say something to cheer me up? It's really difficult, and it puts a lot of people off the Buddha Dharma or the spiritual path in general. It's similar with the Hindu tradition. Somebody recently said to me that they found it difficult, this idea that you just want to shut off the senses and disappear. Because that's what they teach. It's like disappearing into a state of unconsciousness. And it's kind of feels gloomy. In fact, the way they describe enlightenment in the Hinayana, the Theravadan tradition, is like a candle being snuffed out. So the candle flame is glowing, and then when you blow the candle out, there's nothing left. And that's feels kind of nihilistic and depressing. The reality is that the truth of the Dharma is beautiful. And this is the expression of the Vajrayana. This is the meaning of the expression of the Vajrayana, is this perfectly pure, luminous nature of consciousness. But you have to understand that this cannot be recognized as long as there is clinging to reality or non-existence. And again, it's a big topic, right? I go on for days talking about this. In fact, in our retreat center, we have teachings every day, 4 to 6 hours a day, explaining this sort of complexity of the Buddha Dharma. But essentially, you should know that the Buddha Dharma ultimately is hope. It's this hope in progressing. It's this recognition that there is a way out of suffering and the unsatisfactory nature of the mundane world. What happens is we look at the world, look at the world now. There's war everywhere. Everybody's polarized. It's like the truth doesn't matter anymore. Nobody can agree. Politicians are just using tactics to win votes and are not concerned about the people. And then people become hopeless, right? We get this feeling like, well, what can I do? There's just no hope. But what the Buddha taught is that there is hope. Yes, there is suffering. The starting point is to recognize that things aren't right. This isn't okay. Little children and women shouldn't be dying and being blown up by bombs, right? It isn't okay to invade your neighbor, and do horrible things to them. But there is a way out. right? There's this suffering. Where does this root of suffering come from? So classically, in the West, we tend to think, well, it's because we haven't progressed enough. We haven't got sophisticated medicines or technology. That's what we've thought, right? We were told that the development of nuclear energy would save the world's problems. You know, the idea was, it's like with limitless energy, then nobody would fight anymore. That's missing the point. The Buddha taught it's not about those things. Whether you live a simple life or an opulent life, that's not the point. The point is whether or not there is these negative emotions, right? These 84,000 negative spirits, whatever, you know, anger, resentment, all these sort of things. Why do we have those? So the Buddha then said, well, why do we have those? The cause of that is ignorance. What is that ignorance? That ignorance is mistaking this mind-body continuum to be a self. Me and mine. Self-identification. Now we think if I lose a self, then that's scary because I lose me. I don't want to be lost. That impulse, this fear of being lost, comes from this position of ignorance, because actually no self is the most joyous thing that anyone can experience. And that's because suffering only comes from clinging to self. When you no longer have preference associated with this me identification, then there are no longer causes for suffering, even physical pain. I mean, I did talk about this briefly before. It's not like I've got some really high level of practice, but, you know, negative circumstances can be a way for us to gain insight into this. So as I told you, I broke both arms when I was in retreat at some point. And that was actually an incredibly valuable and important experience for me, and very positive, because I was able to look into these things, you know, this source of suffering, and how meditation and recognition replace suffering with bliss. So ultimately, Buddhism is about this supreme joy, this freedom from suffering, and this sort of luminous clarity of mind. But it's difficult because when you're a beginner, then meditation is a struggle, right? Our knees hurt, back hurts, we're falling asleep, you know, we want to be doing something else, but we have to condition ourselves to this. It's like if I get my students just to focus on a little object, like a stone or something like that, then some people find that very difficult. And we don't understand why the mind won't just remain with this object, right? But as we know, the mind remains with whatever it's interested in. So one of these mental factors is like interest. And so if we're watching a movie, we like that movie, then we have no effort to remain focused on that. You know? Or if we see some beautiful boy or girl, then we're compelled to look at them if we have desire, etc. Also, you know, out of anger, if we see our enemy failing or being killed, then we're very attentive to that. And it's the same thing. So what's the problem with us not being able to focus our mind? And that's because we're not in control of our mind. But the truth is, the mind can remain focused without effort. It doesn't have to be a struggle. If there is this kind of intent. Right? But this is something that has to be developed. We have to develop this through our practice. Any tips for turning down excitement during meditation when things start to happen? Yes, Jason. Lights, joy, bliss. Yeah, this is a huge issue. And it's something that's taught in the 16 factors in the path of insight, I believe. So we've got this knowing phenomena, and then there's this forbearing or having patience for phenomena. And if you're experiencing these bliss, joy, clarity, non-thought, then what makes it difficult is the clinging. And this clinging is also what eradicates our experience or our realization. You have to understand this, really important, Jason. So, of course, when we sit in meditation and we feel discomfort, agitation, or we start to suffer, then we can understand how that's difficult to tolerate. But what's more difficult to tolerate is, as you put it, the excitement. So what we have to do is, when you sit in meditation, so sometimes if your meditation is quite strong, then you may have these kind of really overarching experiences of physical and mental bliss. And they're almost intolerable. They're so intense. And what you need to do, and this is the same for suffering, is you need to let go into that. You need to, ultimately, you need to just recognize it for what it is. So you have to remain with that without becoming involved. And there's, again, as I said, there's 3 ways of dealing with any of these experiences. The first one is abandonment. And so in the Theravada Hinayana tradition, what we do is we cut off the sources of giving rise to attachment. So we try to limit ourselves in that. But that is ultimately is taught to gain you liberation from samsara, but ultimately it's not as effective. And then this Mahayana, then it's transformation, and that's using bodhicitta. And so what you do is you experience well-being and you cling to that, and you recognize that clinging as being kind of selfish. And what you do is you imagine that you're taking all of that negativity that others who are experiencing well-being, for example, they're addicted to opium, let's say, opium creates bliss, right? And you take on their negativity onto yours. So you're not saying you don't have to experience it, you're not abandoning it. You're bringing on all the negativity associated with desire from others, and you're putting it on top of yours and saying, I'm taking their negative act, their negative mind poison, but also the results of that, so they don't have to experience the negativity in the future, and also so that they can achieve awakening. So what you're doing is you're transforming what is clinging into something that is virtuous, because it's virtuous because it has a good motivation or intent. And then so that's more effective, and also that leads to final awakening, whereas the first abandonment doesn't. It only leads to liberation from samsara. If you haven't watched my videos, you might be a bit confused here, right? So we've got liberation and we've got final awakening, and they're not the same. But still, liberation is liberation. Once you're out, you no longer suffer. So this second one, Mahayana, leads to the final state of Buddhahood, because it's based on compassion and love. But it's a kind of, it's contrived, right? We're transforming what we normally see to be negative into positive. Now, the Vajrayana view, the third turning of the wheel of Dharma, is to recognize it for what it is. So when I was talking about letting go into the experience of this excitement or this bliss that you're experiencing, will naturally take away this difficulty of excitement. But it very much depends on your level of practice, Jason. Something you can experiment with. Somebody who has the Vajrayana view recognizes the true nature of phenomena. That true nature exists in experiences of intense well-being and joy and bliss, even sexual ecstasy, but also exists when you break both your arms and you get pins sticking out of your arms. So you can see how difficult this topic is. Hello, Dharma Bird. How do I develop more bodhicitta in a city where I cut off in driving and encounter many other rude people? Oh. Yeah, so cities are very challenging. On one side, in worldly terms, then you have everything in a city, right? You can get any kind of food, you can have any kind of experience. Basically anything goes in a city, especially if you live somewhere like where's LA, right? 24-hour city. It's not only you can get anything anytime you want, you can get it 24 hours a day, and it doesn't matter what it is. So that in itself is difficult to tolerate. But in terms of the negativities of a city, it's crowded, there's lots of people, they're rude. Well, this root of bodhicitta, remember, is about changing our natural habit of focusing on our own needs and focusing on the needs of others. That's not something we can do immediately. So what do we need to do? Well, first, we have to see, normally we see ourselves as being more important than others, right? That's our natural way. So first we have to see ourselves as being equal to others. For example, if you're in a traffic jam, everybody's rushing, people are getting upset. Well, we're all in the same boat. We're all stuck in this position. We're all in the same position. And so their needs are as good as my needs. And so, so it's not like I've got some special privilege. And eventually we have to exchange ourselves for others. That means we put others first. So it's a progression, it's difficult. Part of this is that we have to recognize is that their rudeness, their negativity doesn't harm us, it harms them. This is what the Buddha did, right? So there's a story of Captain Great Compassion. This was the Buddha, before the Buddha became a Buddha, previous lifetime. And he was a ship's captain, or she was a ship's captain, probably a he, I suppose. And so Great Compassion then noticed that there was a pirate on board the ship. He was a captain, had 500 merchants, and there was this one, dark character who was a pirate, or he was an assassin. And his plan was to murder all of the merchants and to steal the wealth that they'd accumulated on the ship. And so the Buddha, this captain, murdered this pirate. The pirate's name was Blackspear. Now, our worldly way of thinking is that the Buddha murdered the pirate to protect the merchants. That's not like that. The Buddha murdered the pirate to stop the pirate from killing 500 people. Because if the pirate killed 500 people, then that pirate would go to hell for a very long time. And not only that, but these 500 merchants were all on the Bodhisattva path. So they were all people practicing bodhicitta. And so the harm from this pirate engaging in that was even worse. It means eons and eons and eons of never finding a positive rebirth. So this is very much this kind of idea of bodhicitta. And what you need to look at, really, is you need to look at these 37 practices of the Bodhisattva by Gyaltse Tongme. It's a very short book and it's available anywhere. 37 practices of the Bodhisattva. And it's just pithy kind of instructions. It's like little axioms or something. And it's all about this mindset, this way of thinking that a Bodhisattva has. And the Bodhisattva's way of thinking is all about others. And so this person who's cutting you off when driving and being rude is causing themselves trouble. Not only that, we can directly see that he's going or she's going to arrive at work very angry, pissed off, and going to have a miserable day. And that's what happens when we're open-hearted, kind-minded, and thinking about others, and things go well. And people pick up on this and they treat us nicely. But when we're a grumpy, small-minded, irritable, rude person, then our day never goes right. Everything goes wrong. So in worldly terms, we have to recognize they're causing themselves problems. But in the terms of the Dharma, we need to recognize that these problems are going to follow them lifetime after lifetime. And so with that, then we have to generate this kind of love or compassion for them, this wish that they will not suffer in future lifetimes. And so we don't want to add into the mix any other negativity. So us getting negative only makes things worse, because not only have they upset themselves, but they've upset somebody else. But I understand it's not easy, and you should maybe re-watch my videos on generating bodhicitta, because there's a very specific system that we use in the Sutra Paramitriana, and that is to first start with an object that's easier for us to have love and compassion for. And in general, in the East, that's taught to be our own mother of this life. But I know many people in the West don't even like their parents, so it's a difficult point. But it's all covered in those videos. What are your thoughts on rogue Buddhas, Pratyeka Buddhas? Okay, Pratyeka Buddhas aren't rogue Buddhas. Not really. Pratyeka means self. So this pratimoksha, vows, means self-liberation. So Pratyeka Buddha means self-realizer. And they act a bit strange sometimes, so you might think that they're rogues, but they're not really rogues. What they are is they achieve awakening, but they don't teach the Dharma. And it's not really that they're kind of ignoring people. It's because they appear only when sentient beings' karma hasn't ripened. A Buddha only appears when sentient beings' karma is ripe enough. So there's a specific era or period in our kind of universe, and there's 1,000 Buddhas in our universe. And so at specific times, then all the causes and conditions come together, and then a Buddha will appear. So it's based on our karma. It's not by chance or anything. It's based on our mutual karma ripening that a Buddha will appear. For example, now the world's this sort of mutual karma or group karma is very negative, right? So we'd never experience a Buddha. And so in the in-between periods, then people still become enlightened, but they don't become fully enlightened Buddhas who teach others. They become what are called Pratyeka Buddhas. And Pratyeka Buddhas either live solitary or they live in groups. And so when the Buddha was meditating under the Vajra seat in Dorje Den and became enlightened, then in Varanasi at that time, in the deer park, there were a group of Pratyeka Buddhas. And they were kind of just hanging out and chilling and doing miracles and things. So they probably looked like a bunch of kind of babas or something, you know, a bunch of weirdos or something hanging around in the park. But they were enlightened beings. And when they got wind or they recognized that a Buddha was coming into the world, then they disappeared. They left our world. They don't hang around when there's a Buddha here. So, and they do kind of, the story is they do help people. For example, they might come by and using their clairvoyance, they might help somebody out. You hear these stories, but they don't teach the Dharma. So what happens with the Pratyeka Buddha? Well, often we think that they realize by themselves, so they don't need teachers. So people often say, well, you don't need a teacher to become enlightened because the Pratyeka Buddhas don't have one. But they've had teachers lifetime after lifetime after lifetime after lifetime, so hundreds and hundreds of lifetimes. They've followed a teacher in a really kind of a kosher way. And then in this lifetime, they're born with massive stores of positive karma. But they don't have the karma to become a universal emperor or a Buddha. So it's not exactly the same. And they don't have a teacher in this lifetime. But for example, they'll be walking along, going through the wilderness. They tend to be hermits, right? And they'll see a bone in a graveyard or something. And then what happens is they experience the reversal or the against the grain or reversal of the 12 links of interdependence. So there's the 12 links of interdependence that go forward, that causes creation in the mundane world. And we might cover that at some point. And there's the reversal of that. And Pratyeka Buddhas, first they recognize, oh, there's death. Where did death come from? That came from sickness. Where did that come from? That came from birth. Where did that come from? That came from existence. And they work their way back until they get back to ignorance. And then once they realize the truth of ignorance and they clear away their ignorance, or they recognize their mistaken way of thinking, then they become enlightened. But they don't have the karma to teach in the world. Part of that is about this thing I was talking about, aspirations. So bodhisattvas or people on the spiritual path, as they're going along, they make this aspiration to ripen beings and to purify their realm. And these Pratyeka Buddhas don't do that. And so when the causes and conditions come together for them to be enlightened, which is a bone, and then the 12 links of interdependence, then they become enlightened, and their realization is said to be the realization of a Buddha, but they don't have what are called the 12 deeds of a Buddha. So these ways of manifesting. You see, any topic we get into, it's just like so complicated. And you could, your questions are great, because these are really important points. But the thing is, each one of these questions, I could just go on for hours and hours and hours, because there's so much involved with it. But anyway, it gives us a kind of idea. Dear Lama, hello Ascension. Please share your wisdom on Pure Lands. How does one know which Pure Land to aspire to enter at death? So, I haven't got much time, but I'll just give a very brief answer on this. So the main one, or the only one that is accessible to ordinary beings, is Amitabha's Pure Realm. So if you're familiar with the Chinese tradition, and then what they do is they go Namo Amitabha, right? And they do the Amitabha kind of mantra. It's like a mantra. But again, as I said, it's a lower class of Tantra, I think. It's action Tantra. So it's not the same as these Vajrayana practices. So the primary way is what we call these Pure Lands traditions. So in China, there used to be many traditions, but basically now there's two left. I mean, there is other things going on, but in general, there's only two left. One is the meditators, and one is the Pure Lands tradition. And the meditators, they just sit and they do basically shine all the time. And it's kind of like what we see most Zen people to do. There's no Buddha statues, there's nothing, they just sit and meditate. And then there's the Pure Lands tradition, and these are mostly lay people who just say the name of Amitabha, Namo Amitabha, Namo Amitabha. And you get these little kind of things in temples in the East, right? They're like a little digital thing that plays the sound. Like that sort of thing. They're actually really nice. It doesn't sound nice when I do it, but there's this kind of really tuneful thing. So basically they think if you just say, praise to Amitabha, praise to Amitabha, praise to Amitabha, I will be reborn. And it comes from misunderstanding the sutra on Amitabha. So in the sutra on Amitabha, it says that this is the only pure realm that ordinary beings can be born in. But the thing is, this is ordinary beings on the paths and levels. So that means somebody who's entered the path of accumulation. So we tend to think a layperson doesn't need to study, doesn't need to practice, and all they need to do is say this mantra and they'll be born in pure realm. It's not like that. There are, I think, I'm trying to remember now, 3 things that you need to do. But for example, you have to remain fixed continuously on the qualities of the pure realm of Amitabha. Now, if you haven't studied, you're not going to know what those qualities are. For example, the ground is springy. So when you walk, it's like moss. And so when you walk, it's all light and you don't have to make any effort to like. And then there's ponds of lotuses and all this sort of stuff. So all of these qualities have to be kept in mind. And also the other thing is you have to continually have in mind bodhicitta, right? And if you dedicate yourself to bodhicitta anyway, then you will more than likely be born in a pure land, a pure realm, these heavenly realms of a Buddha. So it's kind of the same cause. Somebody who has like 24/7 always got bodhicitta in their mind, remember bodhicitta is loving kindness, compassion, then basically they're going to enter the path of accumulation anyway. They're going to achieve, if you have renunciation, if you look at my interview with Lama Sotram, that at a young age he developed renunciation and that caused him to have experience. Or if you have bodhicitta, loving kindness, compassion, uncontrived and stable, then that's going to get you to realize states of pure realms, or even gain the path of insight or path of juncture. Now in terms of the Vajrayana, so there we would say infinite palaces. So this Pure Lands talk is more about the Sutra Paramahansa. But in terms of your Vajrayana practice, then if you make a connection with your Yidam deity, then it's taught that you can be reborn in their pure realm or in their mandala. But again, this doesn't mean just saying the mantra and just reading through your text, right? As I said before, that everything that's in this mandala is associated with a kind of iconography and symbology, and that is all kind of philosophical meaning. So it's about developing the view. Ultimately, Vajrayana is about the view. And in order to practice Vajrayana, you need the view. So both ways, it's difficult. Whether you do it in terms of the Sutra Paramahansa and you do Amitabha practice, like in the Pure Lands, and it's not just a question of saying the name of Amitabha, and you have to, you're going to have to study, and then you're going to have really good mindfulness. Or if you're doing Vajrayana, it's even more difficult because you have to realize the view. And it's not certain whether we'll be born in Pure Land. But if you have this intent, aspiration, and pure faith, then that will see you through. And the thing is, you have to give everything up to the three jewels. You take refuge in the three jewels. That means, well, I'm really kind of screwed. I can't do it myself. I have to put myself in your hands. That doesn't mean Buddha's going to do it for you, but you have to kind of give up any hope one way or another and give yourself over to the practice of the Buddha Dharma. Ultimately, the Buddha said, I can only teach you the path to awakening, but you have to tread this path yourself. And that's the way it applies everywhere. But somebody who has got good practice, good faith, that sort of thing, then they won't worry about these things. They will have trust. And you should have trust in the power, the efficacy of your own practice and your meditation, and also in the truth, the verity of the teachings of your Lama or of the Buddha, or somebody that you have faith in. And this goes back to this issue about self-protection and boundaries. So you absolutely 100% must look into your teachers. Come to figure out who they are before you commit yourself to them, and make sure that what they're teaching is an authentic path, and also that you have the requisite faith. And it's very important. If you want to be born in a Pure Land, then principally you have to have very strong faith. But blind faith isn't that useful. We say blind faith is necessary because you need to apply yourself to something. So you have to believe in something. But then what you have to do is, through your study, is to gain certainty. So there's study, contemplation, and meditation. First thing is to research well, come to understand what you're talking about, and then contemplate it, make that understanding personal. And through that, you develop your own certainty. And then based on having that certainty, then your next thing is to meditate in the truth of that and just get on with your practice. So, wow, there's too much that could be said. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. I'm going to have to go. I've got to get back to look after my parents. There's somebody here on Mondays, helps out, but she's got to go soon. So I'll have to leave it at that. Again, at the end, we just kind of shake it all off. A lot said, a lot to think about. But we think, well, if there's any virtue, any merit gained from our interaction, if we've gained something from this, then let's just give it away. Let's take any benefits and spread that out. Use that as something that can help others achieve awakening. Because ultimately, as I said, what's going to cause you to be reborn in a Pure Land is bodhicitta. What is a Pure Land, right? Well, it's not some mythical place in the clouds. That's not what we're talking about here. Everything manifests on the basis of your natural view, the way your mind is. And if you habituate yourself to the negative, if you have doubts, if you have resentment, then you're going to experience difficulty. And so what a Pure Land is when that mind has been purified by love and compassion and only rests in this concern for others, then for that individual, they experience this eternal bliss, heavenly bliss. And in terms of manifest worlds, then yes, that can manifest as great opulence, can manifest as palaces in the sky, whatever you like. What the Buddha taught is that all of this is an illusion, and it's an illusion that arises out of our own kind of misconception. And ultimately, if we undo that misconception, and that means we become awakened, enlightened, then what we experience is the pure natural essence of nature, that is clarity, luminosity. So with that, then thank you all for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. And so until next time, then see you later.